My name is Omar Wasso. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science here. I'm also the co-director with David Brockman of the Citrin Center. I was thinking, going back to the pre-lunch discussion about narrative and storytelling, and I noticed that the conference is following something of a classic film narrative structure. Stories typically follow a structure where a hook draws us in, an inciting incident launches the conflict, rising tension leads to a midpoint twist, a dark moment tests the protagonist's resolve, and then the merry band comes together to fight again and resolve the central dilemma. So if we were going to think about the narrative arc of the conference, Eric's talk was the dark night of the soul. And our panel is called, Can We Bring America Together? So without further ado, let me introduce the panel. Mina Cikara is the Frederick Wortham Professor of Law and Psychiatry and Society and Professor of Psychology at Harvard, where she directs the Intergroup Neuroscience Lab. She studies how the mind, brain, and behavior change when the social context shifts from me and you to us and them, focusing on how group membership, competition, and prejudice disrupt the processes that allow people to see others as human and to empathize with others. She received her PhD in psychology and social policy from Princeton and completed a postdoctoral fellowship at MIT. Lucas Woodley is a PhD student in psychology at Harvard University, where he works in the Green Lab. His research spans two areas: political psychology, where he studies interventions to reduce partisan animosity, and climate policy, where he investigates electric vehicle adoption and battery economics. His work has appeared in Nature, Nature Human Behavior, Nature Communications, and Nature Sustainability. Lucas graduated from Harvard College in 2023 with a double concentration in economics and psychology. Please join me in welcoming Mina Cikara to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you so much to David and Ron for the invitation to come join you all today. Thank you all for joining us. It's a real privilege, especially as a psychologist, to be able to speak with you on some of these issues, because I feel like I'm a little bit of an outsider, but I would like to give you a little bit of background about how it is that came to these questions, to give you the context for why I'm thinking about these things the way that I am. Can we bring Americans together? I'm going to give the Eric Schickler answer and say I think there's a non-zero probability of that. Before I get into any of this, though, of course, I want to shout out my brilliant graduate student, Isaiah Skazai, who's the leader and intellectual engine behind all of this work. So, as you know, my research is all about how coalitions shape people's thoughts, their brains, their behaviors, and so on. But one thing with which I have been obsessed now for several years is how it is that the field of social psychology made what I would characterize as a pretty big mistake by framing social identities, and specifically social categories, as the independent variable as opposed to the product of structural forces and social processes like coordination. And I know all the sociologists in the room know that we're late to the party on this. Despite what you may be led to believe by skimming social psychology's journals, social groups are not fixed or homogeneous entities, and research that treats them as such, as social monoliths, will often end up running into explanatory limitations, and ironically may end up reinforcing the stereotypes that we argue we seek to dispel. As an aside, you might imagine my delight, if you're familiar with Omar's work on Race as a Bundle of Sticks, that he was the panel moderator for this session, because obviously that work has very much informed how I think about these things. So thank you. So when this idea of parties as mega-identities, and we talked about this a lot today, this sort of stacking idea, when this started making this round several years ago, and particularly drawing on the social identity theory tradition from social psychology, it really got my hackles up. And this notion of mega-identities is captured nicely by this quote from Klein, where he says that there are many powerful identities lurking in this list, fusing together, stacking on top of one another, so that a conflict or a threat that activates one activates all. And I want to just make an important distinction, because this has been a bit fuzzy in the conversations we've had thus far today. I'm not talking about issues. I'm talking specifically, when I talk about challenging this notion, about demographic identities in particular. I think that the evidence for ideological sorting is incredibly strong. What I'm not totally sure about is whether or not demographic sorting is as extreme as it appears to be for some of us. So contemporary accounts of US polarization typically assume a bipartite political landscape that's composed of these two sorted camps. And a central claim of some of the work recently in this area is that the surge of political animosity that we've observed is driven in part by the fact that political parties have become aligned with distinct social and demographic groups, such that partisan conflict maps onto these other social divisions. But this creates an interesting puzzle because there's some really, really recent research that suggests that actually objective levels of demographic sorting have remained pretty constant over 30 years' time. So that, for example, I cannot tell better today than 30 years ago how likely you are to vote for a particular candidate on the basis of, say, your race and ethnicity. And so it could be the case that it seems to be the case that actual sorting remains stable, but what I think has received far less attention is the notion of perceived demographic sorting. That is how people believe that these groups go with the parties, and how it is that these social groups organize to give rise to the parties and create political coalitions. And that perception alone, even if it's not based in reality, could plausibly fuel partisan animosity, even in the absence of large changes in objective sorting. And I want to argue that I think that this gap matters because perceived coalitions help us to determine who we think is worthy of special protections, which coalitional partners seem particularly viable, and how social groups become psychologically tethered to the parties. So before I dig into it, obviously, we're building on a very rich tradition of coalitions in politics here from political science. But by contrast to all of the work that, for example, Eric just talked about, we're going to bring it down to the level of individuals and voters as opposed to special interest groups or institutions or political elites. And furthermore, we want to really focus on people's perceptions here, that is, of how these coalitions are organized. So the current investigation departs from past research in a few different ways. The first is that instead of assuming the structure of perceived sorting, we use exploratory inductive methods to discover how it is that different groups are organized inside people's heads. Second, we test whether these schemas change over time and whether or not that tracks with what we perceive to be, or what we've documented as an increase in affective polarization over several decades now. And then third, we collect new data to directly test the question of alignment as opposed to just relying on survey data where mostly we've looked at how much people like each other to try to figure out who goes with whom. And so this approach, this sort of inductive alignment approach, really shifts the analytical question away from how is it that these groups align with the parties to instead, how is it that people think social groups go together to give rise to the parties? Because obviously there's also going to be a sort of remapping of how the parties orient themselves in response to how these social groups start to move together. Okay, so the question here is basically just, are there really two camps inside people's heads? I mean, it's an assumption that a lot of us make when we do our research, but it could be that it's otherwise. So if there really are only two camps, then you only need one axis to sort of divide them in terms of what it is that maximally distinguishes them from one another. But what if there are more? What if there are more clusters? That gives rise to the possibility that there's a multidimensional space. And if that's true, well then there are other axes along which people could align. And this really starts to come back to the conversation we had earlier today about shifting the axis of alignment here. So the way that most scholars have tried to address this question is they typically go back to the American National Election Survey and they look at these thermometer ratings. That is, how warmly do you feel towards many different social and political groups within American society? And so as a first pass, we did that here in this first study, and we looked across all of the waves for which we have data available. And then we tried to use inductive exploratory approaches, and I'll try to simplify this as much as possible, but I'll show a picture on the next slide that I think will make things pretty clear. Now, critically, I just want to argue that just how much you like someone and how it is that those liking ratings go together is not the same question as asking how aligned you think those groups are politically. So this is an indirect measure, we think, of how it is that we think groups go with other groups. But still, we want to start there to see whether or not it is the case that two camps fall out of this analysis. So what I'm showing you here is something called an exploratory graph analysis, which is a totally data-driven approach. And it takes all of the warmth ratings for over 5,000 respondents from this most recent wave of the ANES 2024. And basically what we have is everybody telling us how much they like each of the groups in these maps. But this data analysis approach basically tries to pull out how it is that these ratings go together. So each of these circles or nodes is a group that's featured in the survey. And when you see lines that connect them, that means that their ratings are either going in lockstep together or in opposition. So when it's green, they're moving up together. So like you could see, for example, let's see, MAGA and police, for example, no, they're not. So FBI and Congress, for example, have a positive relationship moving with them. But you also have negative relationships. So there's a red line here connecting MAGA and liberals, because they actually, the more you like MAGA, the less you like liberals. Hopefully, does that make sense? Okay, what's really critical here is that we did not color these nodes. We used a clustering algorithm that, again, makes no assumptions about how these groups should go together to just say, what kind of a structure does the algorithm think is present in these data? And it discovers 3 clusters. So we have an ideologically conservative cluster in red, we have an ideologically liberal cluster in blue, but then we have this 3rd cluster that, at least here, is pretty much exclusively racial and ethnic groups. But later on, and in other surveys, we have different groups. And so we're going to call this a sort of demographic cluster for now. Okay, so the most important thing to take away from this data point, this one little snapshot, is that there aren't really 2 camps in people's heads if what we're using is thermometer ratings to figure out who goes with whom. One question you may be thinking, well, this is 2024. Maybe it looks different in years past. We find this tripartite structure emerges in 1996 and is actually super consistent over time. And interestingly, what you find is that it doesn't actually fit with this notion of sort of accelerating affective polarization over time at all. So what I'm showing you here is kind of how tightly bound each of the groups is to one another within a cluster over how diffuse the whole group space is. And as this number goes down, what that's telling you is that these groups, the clusters, are cohering or crystallizing within, conditional on how groups are scattered in the whole space. It's a ratio compute, basically. So contrary to a simple story of steady polarization, the period from 96 to 2008 was characterized by increasing coalitional ambiguity or diffusion. And it's only after 2008 that it shows a sharp spike down, where these clusters sort of cohere within each other relative to how diffuse they are in the space. Now, one of the things that you might be thinking, okay, I've already told you that feeling thermometers are this indirect measure of these things. They may be poor proxies for alignment. So in the next study, we asked how it is that people perceive 12 of the groups that very frequently appear in the ANES data align with the parties. So here, we're really anchoring the judgments on party alignment. And this is giving potentially the best possible chance for 2 clusters to emerge, because they're anchored to the 2 parties. So for each of the respondents in this survey, we asked people, take the typical environmentalist voter, how often out of 10 issues do you think that they're going to align with the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, or don't know, and so on and so forth. And so the short answer is that even when you ask this alignment question instead of feeling thermometer data, we still recover a tripartite map. And again, it follows the same structure. So we have an ideologically conservative cluster, an ideologically liberal cluster, and then again, this demographic cluster. So this is telling you that there are 3 clusters, but it doesn't tell you how they're being organized. It doesn't tell you what the sort of underlying dimensional or psychological forces are that's distinguishing them from one another. So on one hand, it's possible that there's, again, just one axis, sort of liberal to conservative, and then you could line them up along that axis. But it could be different than that. So in the next study, what we did was we actually asked people to do this inductive task, where we took all of those 12 groups and we said, for each possible pair, how aligned do you think a typical member of that group would vote with the person from the other group? And so you could imagine something like, how many times out of 20 on 20 issues would a typical environmentalist agree with a typical Black voter in America? Okay, one of the things that's nice about this sort of direct alignment approach is that we can take the average ratings of all these different respondents, and then we can project it into a multidimensional space to see how it is that the groups organize. So what we find here is that there are, again, these 3 clusters, but this time we can start to pull apart what the dimensional structure is that underlies how they get pulled apart from one another. So here, on the first dimension, on the x-axis, what you see is like a typical left to right cleavage, right? Liberal to conservative. Those on the blue cluster on the left, and again, we did not draw these clusters. This is a totally data-driven approach based on these alignment ratings. But what is the second dimension? So of course it is the case that just in terms of this sort of liberal to conservative cluster or dimension, you see that these low-income Black, Hispanic, and labor voters are perceived as being somewhere in the middle, but they're also up a ways. And that didn't have to be the way that this map came out. They could have just ended up in the middle between the red and blue clusters, which would just suggest, again, one dimension is enough, but they're being sort of projected out of that first dimensional space. Anyone want to take a guess to what they think dimension 2 is? What's driving those groups up? Go ahead. So tell me why you think social desirability would work on this alignment rating task.
I think there are certain groups where, or maybe social desirability isn't the right word, but there are certain groups where, like, if you're asked, like, what do you think about a racial group?
Yeah.
By default, you're not going to want to say anything negative. You're not going to want to say anything negative or specific about them.
Yeah.
And so there are going to be certain groups like that where I guess it's either capturing sort of just how you default rate someone on a feeling thermometer or something similar to that, basically.
So again, they're not doing feeling thermometer here. We're just asking, and again, also low income and labor show up here. So it's not just racial and ethnic groups in this case, right? And so this is like for them to actually, they're not just not aligning with either of the red or the blue, because all these other groups could be scattered throughout space too. It didn't have to come out this way. They're actively clustering together. Yes? Yeah. Right, exactly. Yes, absolutely. There's all sorts of intersectional identities that could be about. And we have a separate data set that I'm not going to be able to show you today, but it turns out they track pretty closely with these mega categories. But
are you saying a person who's in your study goes into one and only one category?
No. They're just rating these people. Our respondents could be anybody from a nationally representative survey. So they're just making ratings of how they think a typical person from this group and that group would vote together or not. Yes? In the blue, yeah.
Could it be that because business is the dot furthest away?
Yeah.
Business is the dot furthest away from that entire cluster?
Yep.
That's a clue, and if it is, I would say, there's a certain set of interests
Yep.
that labor, low-income people have that they probably don't share with business people.
Exactly. And so this is starting to speak to the realignment axis, right? And also talking about this possibility of economic concerns potentially being the thing that can bring people together that's orthogonal to the sort of ideological things. So we thought that it could be something like a common fate dimension. That is to say that the people who are represented high on dimension 2 are the people who have sort of widespread everyday tangible concerns. I think you call them, Francesca, bread and butter concerns, or kitchen table concerns is another way that people think about it, whereas those who are low on dimension 2 tend to be folks who represent special interests or narrower interests relative to these others. It's not to say that people who are high on dimension 2 don't care about special interests, or that special interest folks don't care about tangible everyday concerns. It's just about the sort of relative prioritization of those concerns that we think is organizing the second dimension. But of course, that's an empirical question. So in a separate study, what we did was we asked people how much they thought each of these groups is motivated by tangible everyday concerns. So in the survey, we say by tangible everyday concerns, we mean things like the cost of living, affording necessities, wages and job security, healthcare access and costs. And then we said, thinking about the typical individual from each of these groups, which one's political priorities are more focused on tangible everyday concerns. And then from all of these pairwise ratings of the groups, you can generate a rank ordering of the group that's most concerned with tangible everyday concerns to least. And then we can plot that against their dimension 2 loadings from this preceding task. And what we see here is a pretty decent tight correlation, right? So the more you care about these tangible everyday concerns, the higher it is that group, or the more people perceive that your group is motivated most by these tangible concerns, the higher your dimension 2 rating. Now, we wanted to also look at some of the downstream consequences of this. And so what we did was we asked yet another set of groups to give us their thermometer ratings about each of these groups. And then we split our respondents into their party orientation, so Democrats versus Republicans. For each of these groups, we can get an affective polarization, or I would just call it prejudice, honestly. We'll just bring it down to one word. Prejudice score for these groups as bifurcated by partisanship. So for example, if there's a high D or a high affective polarization score here, we'd say that people from the partisans from the two parties have really different feelings about that group. But a low affective polarization score is one where they have pretty similar feelings about that same group. Okay, and then we look at whether or not these tangible everyday concerns are related to how polarized feelings are about said group. And what we find is that when you look at how, I'm not sure, is this showing up? No? Okay. The more people say that a group is prioritizing these tangible everyday concerns, the less polarized partisans feel towards them. There's more consensus about feeling good towards them, actually. And I mean, part of this could be back to the point about social desirability. Now we're back in thermometer land, and I totally take that very seriously. But interestingly, we find zero relationship between how extreme in terms of their party alignment these groups are, predicting this affective polarization index that I just showed you. So the take-home message I'd say here is that we find 3 perceived, not 2, coalitions inside people's heads. We see that the structure is organized along 2 dimensions, the first being the classic ideological one, but then the second, common fate one, that's really about just like being able to live a life, a decent life. And then, moreover, that we find this common fate decreases affective polarization. Speculatively, one of the reasons I think this matters is because there's a lot of work in social psychology that says who goes with whom depends on how else we think other groups in the social ecology move with respect to them. So even if perceptions of one group change, like let's say these ideological left groups are painted as being further and further and further left and extreme, even if the other 2 groups don't change and people's perceptions about them don't change, it could change people's estimates on the probability that the green and the red cluster could become a coalition. They seem more viable now by virtue of the contrast to blue. But the nice thing about these data is that they indicate that there could be a different dimension along which alignment could happen. So maybe, just maybe, instead of necessarily moderating ideologically, this blue cluster could try to emphasize its concerns with kitchen table tangible concerns, and that could make a different coalition seem much more likely in this space. Again, totally speculative, and we've just been warned about the pitfalls of prognosticating too much about these things, but it draws out a hypothesis space for us. Okay. The last thing I'll say, do I have time? I have no idea how much wrapping it up. Okay, so this is to Desmond's point earlier today. One of the things I think it's important is that by focusing on parties, we as scholars fall into this trap of illusory essences. And in so doing, what we're doing is we're treating the parties as social monoliths potentially and contributing to the essentialism and polarization that, again, we all in this room say we want to try to decrease at least that toxic aspect of it. So how does thinking about these categories as personalities contribute to polarization? Well, this is something that social psychologists have a ton to say about from attribution theory. If you think the explanation for a person's preferences and behavior is inherent in them, that it's something that's essential inside of them as opposed to being a product of their environment or how they're responding to their social ecologies, well then it's gonna foreclose on the possibility that you think you can negotiate with them, because you just think this is how they are, this is how they all are, and this is how they always will be. And this Rothschild paper finds exactly this. Folks who think about political parties as stereotypes are more affectively polarized and more ideologically polarized. And the last thing I think it does is it really articulates and casts into high relief how it is that the sort of articulation of or creation of these groupings are political projects because they help redraw this political landscape, and then we use these labels to locate ourselves and other people in this political mapping. And so just to be really careful thinking about what it is that the project of creating those categories or identities necessarily means for our politics. So if I had asked you 10 years ago, are you woke? You would have looked at me like I'm crazy. I'm standing in front of you. Clearly, I'm awake. But obviously now that term means something very, very different. So anyway, I'm out of time. I just want to thank my funding sources and my co-authors on this, and all of you so much for your time and attention.
Aha. All right, awesome. So hi, everyone. Thanks for sticking around. I think most of the food is served at this point, so you're really here for good science and good conversation. My name is Lucas Woodley, and I just want to emphasize what a deep honor and privilege it is for me to get to be here with all of you today. And I'm super excited to get to share with you all the research that me and my collaborators have done on Tango, which is a cooperative online quiz game that we created to reduce partisan animosity and to help build bridges of trust and respect across ideological divides. Now, I'm sure I don't need to belabor the point that we live in highly polarized times, but I do want to just plant my flag in the sand about the specific issue that I see with this kind of polarization. And that is that we as Americans are increasingly viewing people from the political outgroup as downright evil. And in cases like some of the recent killings of Renee Good, Charlie Kirk, as violent threats that in turn require violence in order to stop. And so this I really think is the heart of the issue with polarization. And in thinking about how we might address these kinds of issues, so Francesca, you teed this up wonderfully for me, thank you. Here, in theories of evolutionary biology and in about 70 years of classic social science, one answer that emerges in both of these lines of work is the power of mutually beneficial cooperation. So in the context of evolutionary biology, what you have is single cells cooperating to form multicellular organisms, and as you move up these different scales of complexity, eventually you get human beings who can sometimes cooperate to form groups of human beings, sometimes we even get nations, and if we're super duper lucky, maybe even United Nations. At the same time, we also know from social psychological work, starting with Gordon Allport, Sharif, and then going through racial integration in the civil rights era, that mutually beneficial cooperation, putting two people from different groups on the same team, can be an especially powerful force for bridging these kinds of intergroup divides. And so in thinking about what kinds of interventions we might need in order to address such a big, important issue like toxic polarization, I really think that there's three ingredients. And again, Francesca, you are my intellectual guardian angel, the way you've set this up for me. So first, we need interventions that are effective. And so as we heard earlier in the day, there are many interventions and civic organizations that will attempt to, say, host dialogue groups and to help give you a new perspective from somebody from the other side. Not all of these are effective, but some are. But even the ones that are effective, it's hard to think about how you might get an entire country of people to engage in a dialogue group, right? You can't have hundreds of millions of people all getting together, at least not without a massive investment that's beyond the scope of what we all might imagine. And so the second ingredient for what you probably need if you are serious about designing an intervention that tackles this issue is scalability. Now, I want to note here that there's been some great recent research trying to identify interventions that are both effective and scalable. And to wear my biases on my sleeve, Tango was one of the interventions that was submitted to what's called the Strengthening Democracy Challenge, which was one of these very high-profile efforts. But even with this in mind, I do think there's a third ingredient that a lot of social scientists typically miss, and so do practitioners. And that is that if you really want to get beyond just reaching the people who are already pretty interested in building bridges, you also need your intervention to be something that is motivating. And to put that more plainly, it's got to be fun, right? So think about putting two people together on a soccer team. That's something that's fun, and previous research suggests can be an effective way of bridging divides. But of course, you also need it to be scalable, right? So what would be the equivalent of putting the entire country on a soccer team and really thinking about what's at the center of this Venn diagram? So what would an intervention look like that is effective and scalable and fun or motivating to engage with? So, spoiler alert, my answer is Tango, which is a software and a cooperative online quiz game that we developed in collaboration with the Global Development Incubator. In our most recent iteration of the software, we've made it so it's super customizable and you can even play on your phone. For brevity's sake today, I will not have you all pull out your phones and do this. But to give a brief explanation of how Tango works. So first, people will scan a QR code, scan a QR code or click on a URL. You can do this on your phone, your laptop. And then this will take you into the game website, where we'll ask you a few questions about yourself. This is a mix of fun, get-to-know-you questions like, what superpower would you want to have? And then we'll also ask you some questions about what are your political beliefs. And then finally, in cases where we're running experiments, then we'll want to be able to measure how did your attitudes change before versus after playing Tango, and so we'll get some baseline measures of some of those attitudes. Then, once we have this information, we'll match you with a partner, ideally somebody who has opposing political beliefs from your own. And then you'll see each other's responses to these same questions, and we verify that you understand that you're actually working with somebody from the other side. And then we connect you to via an online text chat, like what you see on the right. And so we'll first ask you to spend between 30 and 90 seconds chatting via this online feature. We'll ask you to pick a team name. And then we get to the real meat of Tango. So for most of the experience, you and your partner will be answering fact-based quiz questions together, and I'll show some examples in a moment, and we can all play along. Now, importantly, the only way that you and your partner can earn points, which we often tie to real-world incentives or prizes, is by both submitting the correct answer. And so what that practically means is that you and your partner have to discuss and agree on a joint answer to submit. All right, and then once you've gone through and you've answered many of our quiz questions, then we collect our end-line measures, again, for experimental reasons, and we also give people the opportunity to share their contact information, and if both parties give their contact, then we connect them via email. Okay, so now I will thoroughly abuse my power as speaker and have you all play along with some quiz questions. So typically we start out with questions that are about contemporary events or organizations, but that are non-political in nature. So for example, which AI company recently agreed to pay a $1.5 billion settlement to authors for copyright infringement? A, OpenAI, B, Alphabet Google, C, Meta, D, Anthropic. And I'll note that if you were actually playing Tango, you would each have a partner. You would use this little chat to coordinate on answer. For the present purposes, why don't we just show of hands? So raise your hand if you think their correct answer is A, B, C, D. Yeah, all right, so there's a slight majority in favor of D, and in fact here that is the correct answer. Oftentimes we'll also run these experiments in the field, so recruiting students as part of a university or working with everyday Americans recruited via civic organizations or nonprofits. For example, if we were to run a field experiment here at UC Berkeley with students and alumni, we haven't, but if anybody would like to help me do this, I would love to. We might ask kinds of questions that are tapping into the shared affiliation that you all have, being UC Berkeley grads. So, which group of animals used to live in the Berkeley Hills as part of a research colony? So alumni, this is really testing your trivia knowledge. A, Arctic foxes. B, snow leopards. C, spotted hyenas. D, Bengal tigers.
E, graduate students.
I was told by the IRB I can't put that one. All right, so who thinks it's A? B? C? D? Yeah, all right. Well, you guys did a great job. So here, in fact, it's spotted hyenas. This is a picture of them, I think, taking a bath. They're very cute. And so again, much of these early questions are designed essentially to ease people into the game, get them familiar with chatting with their partner, or agreeing on an answer, and just in general, getting familiar with how the game works. And then we start asking more political questions. So for example, what percentage of US gun homicides in 2023 involved assault-style rifles? A, 4%, B, 19%. I won't make us all play the game. But I'll note here that the specific questions are set up in such a way, and this is on purpose, where one of the answer choices aligns with the intuition that liberals or Democrats typically have, and the other aligns with the intuition from conservatives or Republicans. So just to fully complete that logic, liberals typically think it's a high share of gun deaths caused by assault-style rifles. Conservatives think it's a low share. And in this case, conservatives happen to be correct. But this is balanced out in the aggregate by other questions which go the other way. So for example, if you ask about immigrants and crime, conservatives tend to think immigrants are more likely to commit crime. Liberals think they're less. And in this case, the answer is less. And so what these kinds of questions are designed to do is to really illustrate that sometimes your side is right, but it's not perfect, and other times you get it wrong. We'll also often ask about questions that tap into cultural topics, but that are more likely to be known by one side over the other. So for example, liberals are much more likely to know a lot about musical theater, whereas conservatives are much more likely to know about, say, hunting. And so what those questions in combination with these you're laughing, I suspect, because it's probably true. And so what these two kinds of political questions are jointly designed to do is to A, again, give you that experience of sometimes you're right, but other times you learn something from the other side and you're shown that they're right. And then also, sometimes you benefit from the fact that your partner knows things that you don't know. And everybody can kind of tell that part of why your partner knows that is because they belong to this other political group. And so again, this is capturing this idea of turning mutually beneficial cooperation into an intervention that hopefully, as you all have experienced, is fun, and it's also incredibly scalable. Okay, so I have just one more question here. We can all play along. So which European countries have birthright citizenship? A, none of them. B, Scandinavian countries plus the Netherlands, Spain, and Slovenia. C, all of them except for Hungary and Belarus. Or D, all of them. All right, who thinks it's A? B? C? D? All right, I think pretty much everybody got that wrong. The answer is A. And so I think particularly if this is a liberal skewed audience, this might be surprising to you. If you were more conservatives, this might be less. And so hopefully it's obvious to you that this can be an actually fun way of learning new information. And we also, again, find that it's a really fun way of getting to work with somebody, often from the other side. All right, and so now I'm going to tell you just a little bit of the results from our first main paper that was published last year in Nature Human Behavior. And speaking again to the scalability point, what you see here are dots indicating participants' approximate locations. And what you can see is that throughout the course of these experiments, we were able to effectively connect people from all across the country. I'm going to give a quick sprint through these results, but here's the paper. You can also, I'll have my email at the end. You're welcome to just shoot me an email. So what we find in these online experiments is that playing tango for about an hour has a large and significant, but also durable effect in reducing partisan animosity. So the immediate effect of playing tango with an out-party member relative to an in-party member is about a 9-degree reduction in partisan animosity. To give that in sort of historical terms, that's equivalent to rolling back about 15 years of increased polarization. And we see similar effects for Republicans and Democrats, so the benefits are pretty bipartisan. And in this experiment, we see effects lasting through 1 month, but I'll also note that in some of our subsequent work, where instead of playing 1 long game, you play 3 shorter games spread out over about 2 weeks. There, we actually see effects lasting all the way through 8 months, and we're collecting 1-year follow-up in early May. And so comparing this to other interventions, this is some of the longest lasting effects that you'll see. All right, importantly, we don't just see benefits on people's attitudes, we also see benefits of playing tango on a behavioral measure. So here we ask participants to allocate $100 between a randomly chosen in-party member and a randomly chosen out-party member. What we see in this experiment is that there's positive effects, and we can consistently observe this, and here those effects last through 4 months. Again, in some of our follow-up work, we see effects lasting even longer. And then finally, we also see benefits of playing tango on attitudes that are related to the democratic process. And so this isn't necessarily a given, but here it's great to see. So in this case, what we find is that playing tango with an out-party partner increases acknowledgement that the other side can make valid points about political issues, and those effects last through 1 week. And then we also see benefits for support for political compromise. All right, so hopefully I've effectively made the case that it is scalable and effective. What about fun? So here, the median enjoyment rating that we get is a perfect 10 out of 10, and here you can see some of the free response comments the participants leave. Things like, it was fun as heck, I enjoyed the F out of this experiment. But speaking to this idea that what we're essentially bottling here is mutually beneficial cooperation, we also have comments like the bottom red one, which is made you stop and think and work together towards a common goal. You might also wonder, and this came up in one of the earlier sessions, about what kinds of conversations are effective. So here we just finished analyzing over 30,000 chat transcripts, and what we think is really the secret sauce is this idea of fostering mutual respect. And so what we find is that in conversations where people are working together to discuss and then answer these questions, and they're reciprocally building on each other's ideas, that those conversations show especially positive effects of playing tango. And so again, this work will hopefully be out soon, but it may be instructive for researchers. Okay, so that's it for our online data. I'm gonna, again, quickly sprint through some of our other data. We've also started trying to bring tango out into the field. We've worked with lots of universities and civic organizations, some of which are pictured here. And again, we see benefits of playing tango. So, and in that case, we see effects on perceptions, again, that the other side can make valid points. We also see increases in interest getting to know or talking to somebody with opposing political views. And so if you think that part of the problem for why we're so polarized is because we don't talk to each other anymore, our data suggests that tango can also be an effective intervention on that measure. And again, we see that people enjoy it. And here, most of this data is from undergrads. So this is really clearing a high bar because undergrads do nothing that is not super fun and super engaging. So like we're competing with TikTok here in terms of our enjoyability ratings. And to just quickly zoom in on our largest field experiment where we conducted Tango as part of a field experiment in the Harvard first-year orientation. So there we had over 1,000 students play. And again, we see positive effects on all of the measures I've talked about, including comfort voicing controversial views on campus. And so to the extent that you think higher education should be a place where people need to feel comfortable sharing controversial views and debating those views, we think that Tango can help effectively foster that as well. And I'll note that we see positive effects regardless of who you are and who you played with, but there's also cases in which we see especially positive effects. And then we did a little debrief with students. Here's the students. And in this case, we incentivized successful cooperation by giving the top performing teams tickets to a Red Sox game. And again, positive enjoyment ratings. And speaking to this third ingredient of you need an intervention that's fun. And the reason why is because you want to reach the people who wouldn't normally self-select into bridging motivations. I love this fourth comment here, which is, I'd play this for fun outside of school with my friends, which I think is really the exact kind of audience we need to be cognizant about targeting with our interventions. Okay, and then finally, for real, the last thing is we've also started deploying Tango in the workplace. Here, we see positive effects. The thing I just wanted to draw out is that if you look at the enjoyment graph, pretty much everybody's giving it a perfect 10 out of 10 rating. I think this speaks to the general idea that when you're in a corporate setting, most of the activities that you would engage in, and especially team building activities, are the exact opposite of fun. And so even if you don't care at all as a company about dealing with this issue of toxic polarization and all you want is just a more fun and engaging team building exercise, here we think this might be a useful inroad for getting Tango in front of the place where Americans spend most of their waking hours. Okay, great. And I'll just gesture briefly towards, this has all been in the US, but we're working with collaborators in other regions, so Israel, India, and Northern Ireland. We're also starting to deploy Tango in the wild with Americans recruited via online ads, and we're exploring integrating AI as part of that process. And then finally, and this is maybe what I was most excited to mention at the very end of my talk. So again, Francesca, you offered the bold idea. What if we incorporate a depolarization intervention as part of TV? And Akash, you also noted that politics is becoming like TV. Maybe our interventions could be too. And maybe even if we're going to be super bold, we could turn it into a game show. We did this. And the good news is that, in fact, it works. And so it seems like even watching other people who you can see as Republicans and Democrats engage in this kind of mutually beneficial cooperation, that even just being a viewer of this can help bridge toxic polarization. All right, with that, that's my time. A huge thanks to our many collaborators and my advisor, Josh Green. Huge thanks to our funders. And I'll just conclude by saying, this is my email. Please reach out. We really are at the implementation stage right now. And so if you'd like to help bring Tango to an organization or you know funders or anything of that sort, please, please, please don't be shy. I'd love to chat. Thank you so much.
Do you have any measures on whether this information changes people's policy views? I know vote choice is a lot to ask for, especially in an experiment like this, but the reason I'm asking is to get at kind of like the underlying mechanisms. Like, is it the education piece, the working together piece? Like, the combination of the two? And in terms of like the education piece, how do you think this kind of interacts with other things we know about motivated reasoning and potential like backfire effect and like entrenching views, even if you say you might want more political compromise after like having fun with another person?
So we've measured this, and in fact, we do not see changes in people's political views. So it's not bringing people towards the ideological moderate. Now, the reason that we nonetheless ask those questions and we think that it's useful is because what those questions do illustrate is that sometimes your side is right and sometimes your side is wrong. Now, you might be able to rationalize this by saying, well, I may be wrong about the specific number of gun deaths that happened in a specific year, but I still think my overall policy view is sound policy, or at least more sound than what those people over there are proposing. And so I think there's reasons to expect that it doesn't go perfectly hand in hand. There was a second question sort of embedded in there as well, but I've forgotten it.
Whether you think it's like the education aspect that's having the depolarizing effects that you're measuring, or the kind of like working together, or maybe third thing, what you're saying, like seeing that your side or like what you know might not always be right.
Yeah, so we've run a version of this with a one-player quiz game, where instead of interacting with somebody on the other side, you instead just see, here's what a past person said as their response to this question. And so that's really isolating the experience of encountering the questions and the answers, but without that cooperation piece. So we do still see some positive effects on these affective measures of that one-player game, but it's weaker. And so to us, what that suggests is that each contributes positively to the overall effect. And part of why we don't expect that we see much kind of motivated reasoning or backfiring effects is because in the games, it's balanced. So if you were just getting a lecture disguised as a quiz game where your side is always wrong and the other side's always right, there I expect you would see much more kinds of backfire. But in this case, because it's balanced, it seems more fair. Thank you.
I have a question about a serious and pernicious polarization. Looking at one of your pictures, looked like Oski was one of the participants. Did you pair Oski up with the Stanford tree, and what happened?
I have not. But again, this is me doing a shameless plug for if anybody wants to do field experiments with UC Berkeley students and alumni, email me.
Also for Lucas, so you had the Venn diagram up a moment ago, and I think from all the talks today, I think we're under an impression that like this depolarization was going to require kind of like all hands on deck. So the app is super cool. I'm curious, in the discussions leading up to the project, what other ideas did you have other ideas that maybe fit in that middle Venn diagram piece that like other folks should be looking into? I'm curious if there were discussions along the lines of that.
Yeah, so I think one answer to that is in the form of the game show, right? And so that you might think of as even the much more scalable version of having people play a quiz game. In terms of other ideas, are you thinking more about missteps that we made that we can save others from making, or other ideas that we thought were promising that we just didn't pursue?
No, just like other, like I assume you were brainstorming on this. I'm just curious if there were like other ideas under consideration.
So, I mean, this really was a case where we think that the theory got it right. That is, that the force that you should try to capture is mutually beneficial cooperation. And there's many ways I suspect that you could do that. In our case, as soon as we started thinking about scalability, we agreed that it should probably be something that has to happen online. And so that's narrowed it down somewhat to the online space. And then I think there's a lot of thinking around, well, what would people consider to be fun? And you could imagine more gamified versions, like just playing a game that is not a trivia game or does anything about highlighting intergroup differences in knowledge or views or whatever. And instead just says, here, have a positive experience with somebody from the other side. I expect that would also be effective as well. Perhaps a little bit less so, but I'm not sure.
Let's take a question for Professor Cikara. We've got a hand up here, and while the mic is coming, I'll say, it seems to me one other part of the intervention is not mutually beneficial cooperation, it's humbling.
Yes.
That people are learning a certain humility about their coalition.
I think that's right, yeah.
So this is a question for Mina. In the map with 3 clusters that you showed, where we had this new dimension, I guess I was curious, when people were doing the pairwise placement, is it that they didn't know, perhaps for like, let's say Hispanics, that that there might be a left or right, and they were essentially flipping a coin, and that's what led them to be in the middle, and then there were a bunch of coin tosses, and the groups that ended up that way sort of clustered together? Or do you think there was something in the other studies that you did that sort of more systematically suggests the sort of rejection of the two poles rather than the coin flip? Because there are a couple ways you can get in the middle, right? So.
This is an awesome question. One thing, again, is that the coin flip could have put them in the middle of the red and blue cluster, not at all necessitating a second dimension. That said, maybe there's a sort of like uncertainty or noisiness or something that's coming out in the second dimension. I think that our subsequent data speak against that because we do capture it with this tangible concerns rating. But that said, if you look at party alignment, there is no question about which of these groups with which of these parties these groups are better aligned. So there's this, we have actually the smallest standard deviation on some of these demographic groups. When you ask respondents, well, would they lean more Democratic or more Republican? Everybody knows that Black voters lean really heavily towards the Democratic Party. So it's not just not knowing, it's not uncertainty, but it really does seem to be capturing some orthogonalized poll that also, I forgot to say, but I do hasten to mention, I don't think it boils down to just cultural and economic either, because we have both cultural and economic interests organizing themselves across that first dimension. And then we also have cultural and economic concerns speaking to who ends up prioritizing tangible relative to more special interests on that second dimension. So I don't think it's that either. It doesn't just recapitulate that orthogonal dimensions either. But thank you for the question.
So back to Lucas. Sorry, Mina, I think your work is incredibly interesting. I just don't.
No offense taken. I
agree.
totally agree with you.
Mina has informally agreed to be on my dissertation committee, so in fact, she's. Yeah.
I'm invested.
Lucky you. Yes. Very good. So I have a question that's actually related to the last question we heard, which is, so I also work in your space. I love tango. I've played tango. It's awesome. Cool. And so I have sort of a two-part question here. Yeah. One is, so you had your Venn diagram, right? Mm-hmm. And we have effective, scalable, and motivating. Mm-hmm. I'm curious. So I also care about those three areas, but have thought about a different theory of change around them, and I'm curious your reactions to it. Okay. So I think that there's more than one thing that motivates people, right? So you can certainly, fun is a great way to do it, but like there are other things too. Workplaces have promotion, for example, and that another way that you can scale things is through institutions, right? And so I'm curious if, so in our way of thinking about it, often what we're trying to tackle are actually norms, which you can change, but more slowly through institutions. I was talking to someone earlier about Damon Santola's work, which basically says that you can change behavior by creating circumstances where for an individual, 25% of a threshold, 25% of their peers say that something is acceptable, then it becomes like a thing and you can do it. I'm sure you know this. But first of all, I'm curious if to your way of thinking that fits this Venn diagram. And then I guess relatedly, I am curious if you think that that tango does have an effect on like norms and conflict resolution. It seems to have a fantastic effect on affective polarization, which I love.
Great question. So to the point about there's many ways that you can incentivize people to find an intervention motivating. One of which would be fun, other of which would be maybe a more instrumental kind of incentive. I suspect both would work. I just think that if something is fun, then that can be a kind of incentive that as an individual employee or an individual student, you can go to the higher up and say, I would like to engage in this thing. Wouldn't it be so fun if we all did this? Whereas I think you would maybe have a little bit harder of a time saying, I would love to get a promotion and get paid more as the incentive. And I think the way that the vehicle through which you should offer that is this intervention that I have in mind. In general, also, I think that we try to motivate people with carrots, and there's ways that maybe you could integrate it in an institutional setting that more so uses sticks. One of the pieces of information that I've not yet really mentioned is we've explored, does playing the game repeatedly have compounding effects? And there, the short answer is yes. And so I think as a sort of practical, pragmatic consideration, what that suggests is that one reason we favored the carrot approach over the stick is that it's easier to get people to re-engage with the former. I'm happy to talk more. I realize that was probably an incomplete answer.
Great panel. Please join me in thanking Professor Cikara and Lucas Woodley.
All right, thank you. That was fascinating.